All right. Hello again, everyone. Hope we're all doing well. So, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about Iris Marion Young's Five Faces of Oppression. And we're going to be talking about social justice and oppression in this lecture. So, um, this is all framed as a critique of John Rawls' distributive justice theory. So, according to Rawls, justice is having goods, right, pretty evenly distributed among a group of people. Not perfectly evenly distributed, because this is impossible, but it's to have those who are the very worst off, meaning they don't have very many goods, are made better off by our social arrangement, right? Such that there is overall equity, right? And the inequality that does exist is justified by the fact that those who are the worst off benefit from the inequality. So one of the problems here that Young is trying to get at is that Rawls is too focused on goods being evenly distributed. So she wants to say that oppression is not a matter of merely having goods equally. Rather, there are other sorts of matters to take into mind when we're thinking about what justice really looks like, right? So the philosophical point here is that an equitable distribution of goods is not sufficient for justice. It may be necessary for justice, but it's not sufficient according to Young, right? So Young wants to say that oppression can take many different forms, and it's the very subtle sort of exclusion of some social groups from society. So let's think about oppression. So oppression isn't like a tyrannical ruling of one person over the king oppresses all of the people, right? The slaves are oppressed by the slave masters. It's not that, right? And it isn't always very obvious either. So it can often exist in moments where some members of society may not even recognize that they're participating in oppression or that they're oppressed. So oppression, a working definition, is injustices that groups suffer as a result of the normal processes and interactions of everyday political, economic, social, and cultural life, right? So bracketing Young for just a moment, we could talk about Marilyn Frye's conception of oppression. According to Frye, oppression is the limitation of some individual's autonomy in virtue of being a member of some social group, right? So the expectation that women be mothers, the expectation that women be keepers of the home, right? All of these expectations, which are all kind of normal in society, right? Or have been normalized, all of those expectations limit some individual woman's autonomy. And so it's as if all of these different norms and expectations sort of make up all of the rungs of a jail cell, right? Such that the person is trapped inside of the jail cell as a result of all these expectations and all of these norms, right? So getting back to Young is going to define oppression in several different ways, but we can also think of oppression as the unjustified limiting of somebody's autonomy in virtue of their social group. So we need to distinguish, or we need to talk about what social groups are and what mere aggregates or associations are. So a social group, according to Young, is a collection of people differentiated from at least one other group by cultural forms, practices, and or the way that they live together, right? So, for instance, people who are Catholic make up a social group, right? These are all people who share a cultural practice, taking the Eucharist, going to confession, going to mass, right? And in that way, we could talk about Catholics as a kind of social group. And depending on how the rest of the social groups treat people who are Catholic in virtue of their being Catholic, we can find oppression, or we can find no oppression, right? So the idea here is that when we have a social group, they share some sort of practice together that makes them distinct from other social groups. Okay. So now we can talk about what she says are the 5 faces of oppression. And these 5 faces of oppression always deal with social groups. They don't deal with individuals, right? We can think of an individual being oppressed in some sense, but it's in virtue of membership in some group, a social group, right? Oh, let me go back momentarily. I forgot to talk about mere aggregates. Mere aggregates are a collection of people merely based on some attribute, right? So, for instance, consider the feature or attribute being brown-eyed, right? People who are brown-eyed don't like get together and have like brown-eyed people meetings. They don't they don't have like brown-eyed people holidays, right? So we can talk about all of the brown-eyed people as a mere association, right? So they're not a social group because they don't share practices, cultural forms, or ways of life together, right? So a social group is distinct from a mere aggregate because of these cultural practices and these norms that those people accept. Okay. Now, oppression, as I was saying earlier, always happens with social groups, not necessarily individuals, and not necessarily to mere aggregates, right? So the first face of oppression is exploitation. And notice here that all of these faces of oppression deal with various power dynamics and power structures, right? So some social groups or one social group has more power than other social groups. So, for instance, exploitation is a form of oppression where there is unreciprocated or unequal transfer of power between 2 different social groups. So the most obvious one is kind of comes from Marx. It's economic exploitation, and the idea here is that workers are transferring their power to the owners of various companies or organizations, but the owners or those organizations don't transfer the power back, right? At least not to the same degree, right? So when somebody's working for minimum wage and they have no prospect of any forward movement, we could say that some particular individual, in virtue of being grouped with the social group worker, is being oppressed, right? That's at least what Young wants to say about this. We can also talk about gender exploitation or racial exploitation, right? Where women and men, 2 different social groups, there's largely a dynamic of caring for the man, right? Caring for the man's home, serving the man, and the man doesn't reciprocate those sorts of things, right? Now, that's not true in every case. There's not always going to be gender exploitation in every single place, right? But the idea here is that there's an uneven transfer of power between sometimes between men and women, right? Where the man doesn't have to care for the kids, the man doesn't have to care for the home, right? He can just sort of go as he pleases and do a number of different things, right? So the man benefits from the woman's work, according to Young. Okay, next we can talk about marginalization. So marginalization has to deals with the removal of some social group from economic or social or political life, right? So, for instance, I think it's good to look at an example. For a long time, courthouses didn't have ramps that went up to the door, right? There were only stairs. And so people who couldn't walk, people in wheelchairs, the elderly, these folks were excluded or marginalized from participating at the courthouse, right? And it's not the case that anybody, there's like an evil doer. He's like, yes, I'm going to not put any ramps anywhere. Ha, ha, ha. You know, there's nothing like that, right? Rather, it's just a kind of negligence or a kind of a lack of recognition that these people exist, right? But in a way, not having a ramp to the courthouse excludes that social group, namely those who cannot walk, right, from economic or political life, right? So if you can't go to the courthouse, you can't do the things that the courthouse offers, right, which is participating in a number of events and a number of political activities. Next, we get powerlessness. Powerlessness involves is rooted in the status between groups and the leverage of privileges related to it. So I have my notes here. So when some group is powerless to another group, they don't get any say in what they determine to be true, right? They don't get any say in what's going to happen to them, right? So some members of some social groups, their views and opinions, right, or what they need is not recognized by the dominant social group, and such that the dominant social group contends to know what they need more than they do, right? Young gives an example of I believe it's a nurse practitioner and a woman of color, and the woman of color says what she needs, right? And she's gotten it before and these different things, and the nurse practitioner or the doctor won't listen to what she needs, right? So this can take place in economic life, this can take place in social life, right? And it involves sort of the powerless social group sort of lacking a kind of self-authority or a sense of self, right? So that's problematic. Next, we get cultural imperialism, which Young wants to say involves the dominant social group's sort of narrative. So the dominant social group has some sort of history or some sort of narrative that is taken to be, quote unquote, what it is to be human, right? So for instance, folks who say that, you know, not saying that I think this myself, but folks who say that, you know, the Odyssey and the Iliad in Western literature kind of give an overarching account of what it is to be human. That kind of view, according to Young, runs the risk of cultural imperialism. And that's because they're not taking into account other social groups, various sort of narratives, right? Rather, these smaller narratives or these at least less powerful narratives are smothered by the dominant group's narrative, right? So we are what it is to be human, the dominant social group says, and the sub-social groups get no say in what it is to be human, right? They're somehow subhuman or somehow weird or somehow, you know, their form of life is not somehow perverted in some way or is lesser than. So the idea is that there's a kind of invisibility. And then when these smaller social groups, when their narratives come to light, right, or get recognition, they threaten the dominant social groups' claim to what it is to be human. So this is a little bit of a weird one. We may also think that cultural imperialism involves like taking things from smaller social groups, right, or less powerful social groups. So this can involve like taking words or concepts or pieces of art or art styles from less powerful social groups, and then like passing it off as like something that the dominant social group has undergone, right? So this is a kind of cultural, what we might call appropriation, which I think is similar enough to cultural imperialism, I think. Okay, great. So lastly, we have violence. So violence is a form of oppression where either two things are the case. One, there are violent acts done by members of the dominant social group against members of a minority social group, right? So, for instance, a good example might be Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany, there's plenty of oppression that's going on. Namely, you have a minority social group, Jews, a dominant social group, Germans, and Germans were committing acts of violence against the Jewish social group, right? Such that in virtue of being a Jew, you were either the victim of violence, or, and this is the second part of this, you're afraid of being the victim of violence. So violence, the oppressive form of violence, doesn't, according to Young, require that there be violent acts. Rather, it requires, at the very least, that the minority social group fear being the victim of a violent act, right? So if you have a social group who fears being the victim of crime, right, or being the victim of a violent act, then you also have you have this oppressive form of violence, right, in Jung's sense. So there's a form of oppression, it's called violence, and we can meet that merely by being afraid of being the victim of a violent act. Okay, so today we've talked about Iris Marion Young as a kind of critique of Rawls. So it seems like Rawls doesn't quite go far enough in his account of distributive justice. And what we see here is that there are other things that are partially constitutive of justice. And Rawls kind of misses all of that, according to Young. So thank you all. I look forward to seeing you all next time.